One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases, and it's the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
Hey guys, this is Dr. Steve Noseworthy. Welcome back to the Inflammation Nation podcast. Today, I'm just going to be doing a one-off episode. And by that, I mean, like, you guys have been around long enough to know that usually what I do is I pick a topic and I might take half a dozen or so different episodes to help you develop a knowledge base around specific concepts. And so again, today's going to be a one-off, and I was just literally sitting around thinking, hey, what do I want to talk about next? Because we just clued up our series of episodes on obstacles to weight loss. And, I thought maybe it's nice for people, I just kind of imagine being in your shoes and sitting back thinking, like, where am I going to get help? How am I going to get some answers? What can I do on my own? And if I go see somebody in the functional medicine sphere, how do I know that the tests that they're going to recommend to me are valid and accurate and reliable, reproducible, all the things that we want from scientific testing? So I thought that I would put together an episode about, maybe 4 tests or so that I personally wouldn't waste my money on. And I guess that's always a good metric. Like, would I spend my own money on this? Anytime that I recommend a test to somebody, I come from it from that perspective. Would I spend my money on it? Would I tell my wife, my dad, my sister? Would I tell them to do it? And if the answer is no, then I'm not going to recommend it. And so in that vein, I want to make sure that I don't put any specific labs in the crosshair, because there are some good labs out there that in general do good functional medicine diagnostics, but maybe they have 1 or 2 tests that are maybe a little bit more marketing and fluff than they are reliable information. And unfortunately, there are some labs out there, and again, I'm not going to name labs because I don't want to be that guy. I'm not going to call people out in that sense. But I do think that it's useful for someone in your position to have a little bit of guidance, to have somewhat of a sounding board to say, hey, is this a good idea? And I'm picking 4 tests particularly because some of these things are very common, just bottom line. And again, if you've been listening to the podcast for long enough, then you realize that in some respects, because functional medicine is not a regulated domain, anybody can do something related to diet, lifestyle, nutrition, use diagnostics and say, hey, I do functional medicine. And they might be doing something completely different than what I do. Or maybe they're doing something that goes against what is generally accepted under the moniker of functional medicine. And that's fine. I'm not saying everyone needs to do things the way I do it. There's, the way I do things is just one good way of doing a bunch of stuff. And there's a lot of other good ways that maybe I don't think that way. But there are certainly some things that fall into the realm of either diagnostics or even treatment and therapy in the world of natural or functional medicine that really kind of just doesn't pass the sniff test. But unless someone comes along and says, hey, you might want to rethink this, it might be difficult for someone like you, either accessing testing and diagnostics on your own or working with a practitioner who does functional medicine, or at least claims that they do. It might be difficult for you to go, well, I don't know if I want to spend my money on that, because when you walk into someone's office or get on a Zoom consult, you just kind of expect that the person you're talking to and working with knows what they're doing, and they have done their due diligence. And unfortunately, practitioners and healthcare advisors are just as susceptible to slick business and marketing tactics in many cases, because they themselves don't understand human physiology. And that puts them in a position of really just kind of having to take someone else's word for it. So anyways, I just wanted to pre-frame my list just with a couple of comments on that, because again, I don't want to throw individual companies by name under the bus. I'm just going to talk about different types of testing approaches, and I'll leave it up to you to, if you want, do some Google searching to find out which companies are offering the types of tests that I'm talking about. All right, so number 1 on my list is intracellular nutrient testing. And as far as I understand, there's one company that kind of stands out in this field, and it's very commonly used in the world of nutrition, dietitians or dietetics, as well as natural functional medicine. The thought sounds pretty good. We draw your blood and we send it off to a lab, and the lab will basically split open one type of your blood cells and look at the nutrients that are inside, with the idea that what is circulating your blood may not necessarily reflect what's actually inside your cells, what has become bioavailable for your cells to use. And from a conceptual standpoint, that makes a lot of sense. And we do know that serum testing of a wide range of nutrients, like certain vitamins and minerals, do not necessarily reflect intracellular contents. And so there certainly is something to the concept of doing intracellular nutrient testing. Now, having said that, and as I go through this list, it might best be for me to use some stories of interactions that I've had with other practitioners, most of these actually in seminars, functional medicine seminars that I've taught over the years. But let me just explain this, and forgive me, I don't remember. It was probably about 4 or 5 years ago. I can't remember what state and city I was in. But I was teaching, I believe it was functional blood chemistry analysis to a group of doctors and nutritionists and naturopaths. And at one point on a break, we had been going through these case histories, and basically the way it works is we would talk through a specific topic or biochemical pathway, talk about how changes in that pathway result in different health challenges, look at diagnostics that are appropriate, and then talk about what we might do with them from a clinical standpoint, knowing that there's not just one way to do all these different things. And so this young lady came up to me on a break and asked me, and she did name a company, which I'm not going to do, but she said, do you do this type of testing? And she was talking about intracellular nutrient testing. And I had not met her yet. And so I asked her what her background was. And she said, well, I'm a nutritionist. And so I said, well, let me ask you this. How often do you run this type of testing? And she said, I do it on all of my clients. And, in order for me to do a particular test on all of my clients, there has to be broad applicability and real clinic utility in doing that test. I mean, it's got to give me something that's actionable, not just something that I can do something about. Otherwise, that's just information. But I need to be able to run a test, look at the test results. Number one, understand, I guess number two, understand what the test is telling me, have something to change. Otherwise, it's just information. And then have a reasonable expectation that whatever it is that we're changing is going to have a positive outcome. And so I said to her, well, if you do this on every test, and let's say that you run a bunch of tests and you find multiple intracellular nutrient deficiencies. And she said, I see this all the time. I said, right. And I said, how often when you prescribe vitamins and minerals and you do retesting and you find that most of them are corrected, how often does that translate into a significant change in their health and their quality of life? And she paused for about 3 seconds and she said, never. I said, right. So that should make you think about why you're running the test and what utility it has in your practice. And I said, just think about this like logically. Even though the standard American diet is what we would consider a crap diet, it is so fortified with vitamins and minerals, aside other reasons why it would be crap. It's so fortified that thinking even people on a standard American diet are going to have widespread nutrient deficiencies is probably not quite realistic. And she said, I would probably agree with that. And I said, so what kind of process could be going on if we can assume that there's broad nutrient availability in even a standard American diet, yet you're still finding widespread nutrient deficiencies at an intracellular level for these people that you're testing, which you said is 100% of your client base? What could cause that to happen, assuming the nutrients are available in the diet? And she thought for a second and she said, well, it probably tells me more about their gut health and possible malabsorption issues. And I said, bingo. That's exactly what you're seeing. Like if you run one of these intracellular nutrient tests, now if it comes back and says one nutrient like magnesium is low and everything else is normal, then yeah, you might be dealing with an isolated nutrient deficiency, and it's very easy to supplement that. And just so happens that magnesium deficiency is fairly common. for a variety of reasons. But anytime you run a test, like a nutrient deficiency test, and you come across widespread nutrient deficiencies, even if it's in serum rather than inside your cells, chances are, unless you're dealing with someone who has a severely limited diet, what you're dealing with is nutrient malabsorption, which points you back to gut health. And that leads you down a completely different road, because at the end of the day, even if I have multiple nutrient deficiencies, if all I do is supplement their diet with different vitamins and minerals in supplement form, or maybe I have them eat different types of foods that have higher amounts of all these individual nutrients, at the end of the day, having a normal intracellular nutrient test result doesn't change the reality that they have a gut issue that you haven't figured out and haven't fixed yet. And we had that conversation, and as we kept going through, and it took about 10 or 15 minutes, you could see the dawning of realization. And she basically said, I guess I need to go back to the drawing board and rethink whether or not this is actually working for me in practice. And I said, exactly. That was actually a really good conversation. So test number one that I personally wouldn't waste my own money on, let alone that of someone else that I'm helping, is some kind of an intracellular nutrient testing. Test number two, or category number two, and always going to be a lot of people that disagree with me on this, is genetic testing for the purpose of determining nutrient or lifestyle needs. Now, there's all kinds of companies out there these days that will take your, say, like a saliva sample, for example, and show you your ancestry, and then give you a whole printout of what might be happening in your health and wellness, or where you might have these weak links, if you will, and make all kinds of recommendations for supplementation, lifestyle changes, sleep habits, stress reduction techniques, all this kind of stuff. And I will tell you that I jumped on this bandwagon when it first started coming out. And I'm not talking about 23andMe specifically, but 23andMe was the company that first, to my knowledge, came out with basically direct to consumer as well as physician testing that looked at what we call nutrigenomics. And nutrigenomics is this field of trying to determine nutritional needs by looking at DNA testing. And what has evolved out of that, and this was a really big deal for probably the first 7 years or so, was looking at a process called methylation. MTHFR, CBS mutations. These are called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs for short. Easiest way to think of it is some kind of a variation in a gene that may affect its function. And so it's one thing to say that, hey, we can do a DNA sample and show you exactly where your genetics have gone wrong, which is not really an accurate statement. And it's quite another thing to come to the realization that when you look at someone's gene testing, if we assume that the gene testing is accurate and correct, it's another thing to say, well, you carry this gene and it is, without a doubt, 100% affecting how this system functions. And that's simply not true. Basically, when you look at someone's genomic profile, you look at their, let's call it a DNA printout, you're looking at the realm of possibility. Because just because you carry a variant in a particular gene does not mean that that is going to happen in your life. You may be genetically predisposed, for example, to heart disease or to Hashimoto's hypothyroidism. Yet if you mind your P's and Q's and you've got good diet, lifestyle, environmental control, you may never actually get those things. And so we kind of came at this whole new avenue of exploration in the noble pursuit of trying to help people. Like most docs, including myself, will consider almost everything if it puts us in a position of being a better clinician, making better recommendations, and helping people to a greater degree. And so when this whole gene testing thing and nutrigenomics came out, there was like a big hullabaloo, and it was being hailed as like a new era of natural medicine. And it simply hasn't turned out to be the case, if only for the reason that we very quickly came to the realization, number one, that just because you carry a gene doesn't mean it's manifesting in your life. It's just a picture of what might be happening, not will be happening. Now, you can take that and you can develop a supplement regimen that is based off what might be going wrong or what can't even get that out, what might be or what might go wrong in the future. But then you end up taking a whole bunch of stuff that's not necessarily helping you on the off chance that something might trigger and become a problem down the road. So that's one problem. The other problem is that there are literally millions of different combinations. Actually, statistically, it's probably in the billions, if not trillions, of different combinations of genes, some of which offset each other. So, for example, I might carry a gene variant that says I might have problem A. And again, I might have it, not I do have it. And then I might have another gene variant or more that actually counterbalances that. So my probability of that actually showing up is pretty much zero. And in fact, we have gene variants that protect us against certain things, and we have gene variants that might promote other problems. And there's absolutely no research right now on how the combination of all of those things play out in one individual person over long periods of time, even with or without changes in diet, lifestyle, or environmental control. And so when you get beyond this kind of enamored response of, gosh, I can send someone a DNA sample and they're going to tell me with 100% precision what I should be doing with diet, lifestyle, supplements, and environmental control. Once you get past the enamored reaction, you start to realize that this is not true. And here's a case in point. And this actually happened to me in the recent past. I actually haven't done this kind of testing, this gene testing, for quite a long time, even though I did jump on the bandwagon in the beginning. What ends up happening are these companies are putting out these really slick looking reports that are padded with all kind of information. So some of these might be dozens of pages long, which tends to lend credibility to their process. And please do not be impressed by someone who gives you a 25-page report as opposed to someone else who might give you a one-page report of the things that really matter that you can count on, right? Brevity of information does not mean the information is wrong, and an overabundance of information does not mean the information is correct. Yet this is a marketing tactic that labs use all the time. They pad their reports with useless generic information that makes it seem like they really know what they're doing, and you should take this seriously. Simply not the case. So there was, and I'll just stand on this because I feel like I'm going off the rails on this particular one. This is one that really kind of burns me. But there's a journal called Nature. Nature is actually an organization that has a family of journals that deal with different subtopics in the domain of health and wellness. And they published a paper. This was back when 23andMe was about the only company that was doing this testing. Now I could probably name a half a dozen off the top of my head. And if I did more research, I could probably come up with a dozen different labs that are doing the same kind of thing, all of which claim to have kind of cracked the code in using this nutrigenomic data. But nevertheless, Nature published a study where they took saliva samples from people and did what they call a split study. And a split study is where you take a sample, whether it's blood or saliva, it doesn't matter. And you basically create two identical samples. So you take a sample, cut it in half. And so they did the split sampling test where they took saliva and DNA testing from a whole bunch of people and sent half of each sample to 23andMe. And again, I'm not bashing 23andMe because they do pretty cool work with Ancestry and all that kind of stuff. And then they took the other half of the sample and sent it to basically a research lab. And the results of the study showed that the commercial company that did the testing, as compared to the research lab that had no commercial interest, it showed that they had a 40% false positive rate. Now, false positive is where a test says you have something and you really don't. And 40% is a massive number. That basically says that the data is completely unreliable. Now, I could see doing something that maybe has a 5% false positive rate because you still think, well, there's a 95% chance that this is true. But when that false positive rate hits 40%, I mean, you're literally wasting your money because just because it says it's a problem, there's absolutely no guarantee that it is. The other thing that they found in that study, and these were the two conclusions that they came out in that paper. Number one was high rate of false positives. And number two is that a lot of the companies, especially starting out in the first, say, 5 years or so, the companies that provided the raw genetic data didn't really interpret the data. And so there were other companies that you could, pay a $40 fee and upload your gene report, and it would spit out this report about diet, lifestyle, supplements, et cetera. And so the Nature study basically said that these third-party companies that were interpreting data for people to use either in practice or in their own lives relied on publicly available gene databases that were either incomplete or frankly incorrect. And so now all of a sudden, one of these problems and challenges by itself, quite honestly, is enough to say, well, I don't want to waste my money on that. When you start stacking 2, 3, 4 major reasons why this is a bad choice to use genetic data to determine how to order or organize your diet, lifestyle, and all these different things, it just doesn't make any sense. Have I done it myself? Yes, but I did it mostly because I wanted to see what my genetic makeup was. And I did have a marginal interest at the time because it was very new in seeing what kind of genetic or diet lifestyle advice came out of that. Anyways, not something I would spend my money on, and I don't recommend it to the clients that I work with. Testing category number 3 of things that I wouldn't waste my money on is urinary neurotransmitter testing. This is another big one. This is another one. And again, I jumped on the bandwagon. This was back when I was just getting into functional medicine. So we're going back a long time ago. And I thought, oh gosh, hallelujah. We have a way to figure out what's going on with the neurochemistry in your brain, which is really how this stuff is being promoted. Basically, the idea is you can pee in a cup and a lab can measure urinary neurotransmitters. And from that data, we can conclude, for example, what level of serotonin you have in your brain, or dopamine, or acetylcholine. And so here's the baseline of this stuff. Let me tell you the takeaway first. No, let me do it the other way. Basically, the brain, when it comes to the main neurotransmitters that run the show, I'm talking about serotonin, dopamine, acetylcholine, GABA, and to a certain extent, the catecholamines, adrenaline and noradrenaline, or epinephrine, norepinephrine. With the exception of the catecholamines, your brain makes its own neurotransmitters. It's not like you make it in your body and then it circulates around your blood and crosses the blood-brain barrier, gets into your brain where it exerts some kind of function or control. Your brain makes its own serotonin. Your brain makes its own dopamine, its own GABA, its own acetylcholine. Now, catecholamines, again, think adrenaline. Catecholamines do cross the blood-brain barrier. And so if you get a stress response and your adrenals starts to pump out these stress-related hormones called catecholamines, they can and do get into your brain where it changes how your brain acts. And even though most of the serotonin in your body is produced in your gut, the serotonin produced by the gut does not get into your brain. It just does not. It cannot cross the blood-brain barrier. And, we see evidence of these problems in the early years of Parkinson's research, for example. In the early days of Parkinson's research, they tried to give people dopamine, and Parkinsonism, which is a family of conditions, including Parkinson's disease. But Parkinsonism is classically a disruption of dopamine production in a part of the brain called the substantia nigra. And so in the early days of research, they said, hey, this is a dopamine issue. Let's give people dopamine. Didn't do anything. It didn't help. Why? Because dopamine does not cross the blood-brain barrier. And if you swallow it in a pill or slap it on your arm in a cream or get it injected, it does not get into your brain. Neither does the serotonin produced by your gut. Neither does the GABA produced by your Krebs cycle or your energy metabolism. Neither does the acetylcholine that you might have circulating in your general body. And so you have to think about the for the most part, right? There are some exceptions like the catecholamines, things like histamine or phenylethylamine produced by the body. These can cross the blood-brain barrier. But the ones that drive most of your brain regions and most of your neural pathways do not. So when you pee in a cup and a lab measures the neurotransmitters, which is an accurate and reliable test, labs can measure neurotransmitters in urine. That's not the question. The question is, can we take peripheral neurotransmitter metabolism as indicated by peeing in a cup and having a lab measure what's in the cup. We can't. The question is, can we extend that to what's happening in the brain? And the answer is heck no. There's no connection, absolutely none. And so why would you waste your money peeing in a cup, spending hundreds of dollars to get a report that tells you nothing other than, hey, your gut's probably messed up? Well, guess what? You probably knew that to begin with, and it's got nothing to do with your brain. And so, yeah, I jumped on the bandwagon with this. And within a period of about 6 months of using this, I didn't use it on all of my clients that I was working with at the time, just the ones that seemed to make sense. What I found was that there was no rhyme or reason as to the results, the treatment recommendations. That's another point I'll come back to. And the outcome of the supplementation versus the results on retesting. And so what ended up happening is, we might find, for example, that we do an initial test and we found somebody has XYZ imbalances in their neurotransmitters. And again, this was before we understood the science and the physiology. And so we would put somebody on recommended supplements, and then maybe someone was doing really well with the supplements, but their urinary test looked worse after the fact. Or it would be the other way around. Their test would look pristine after we treated them with supplements, but they were actually getting worse from whatever brain-based complaint. A lot of this is like depression, anxiety, and brain fog, this kind of stuff. So there was zero correlation between outcomes and test results. And this is where we started to question, well, is this really telling us what we want to know? And we started to dive into the research and realized, well, crap, no pun intended, urinary neurotransmitters only tell us mostly about the gut. It's all about peripheral production and metabolism, and for the most part has nothing to do with your brain. Here's a quick story before I finish off with the last item. Years ago, this was back when we were in the Bradenton, Sarasota area, and I had a lady that I had worked with off and on. She was actually a great client, and she would come to me with problems, and we would work together for a short period, and then she'd disappear because she's doing really well. Well, I hadn't heard from her for probably a couple of years, and I got a message from her one day that she had gone to see another practitioner in our community, and she got really messed up. And I didn't quite know what she meant by that. So I said, hey, come on in and let's talk. So she comes into my office, and she's got this stack of labs she had done over the last couple of years. And she started telling me this story about how she had gone to this one practitioner, and they had done this urinary neurotransmitter test, and she put her on all kinds of supplements, and basically it screwed her up. It made her way worse. And she wanted me to fix her neurotransmitters. Well, at this point in my career and my own clinical development, I came to the understanding that it's not valid testing. It doesn't do what we thought and what everyone hopes it does. And so I was flipping through the paperwork, and I came to her neurotransmitter test, and I put it off to the side, and I continued flipping through as I was listening to her tell a story. And she got frustrated with me, and she reached over and grabbed the neurotransmitter test and shook it at me and she said, I need you to fix this. And at that point, I had to give her, kind of a kindly explanation as to why she had wasted her money, and that I wasn't going to do anything with that because I couldn't. I couldn't do anything with it because it didn't tell us anything that we needed to know. And remember, this is one of the ways that we assess the clinical utility of a test. Number one, does it give us information we can't get anywhere else? Number two, can we understand the results? Number three, does it give us something to change? And number four, what is our reasonable expectation of a positive outcome? And if a test fails any of those things, we don't do it. There's no point. Now, we might go through a period of investigation and with people who are willing to spend money knowing that it might not help us, but hey, let's try to see if we can do something with this. We might do that when we first come across a new testing methodology, but it's really kind of clinical trial and error. And some people are willing to extend that or to interact with that. And so she was kind of crestfallen, to be honest, because she had seen this other practitioner many times, had spent a lot of money, not just on testing and supplements, but on consultations. And, the truth is, as we went through what had gone on with her and refocused on what the core problems was, lo and behold, a couple of months later, she's doing so much better. So lesson learned, right? The funny thing is that when she left my office, I had kept her paperwork to scan into my charting system. And this one particular company that her practitioner had used to do her urinary neurotransmitters, on the bottom of the first page had a caveat. It had a disclaimer and I'm paraphrasing, but it basically said, hey, this doesn't tell us anything about your brain. It was right there on the first page. And yet not only did she expect the test results to tell her about her brain, that's what the practitioner told her. And I can't fault her, because there was a time when I did the same thing until I learned the differences. So there you have it. I would not spend my money or your money on urinary neurotransmitter testing. Now, the final one is going to be hard for me to talk about this one without, well, I'm not going to name the company, because thankfully the name of the lab is not the name of the test, but this is called the Dutch test, DUTCH. And it stands for dried urine total something hormones. Basically, I don't even know what it stands for, but it's something like that. Basically, it's a, they use dried urine to measure metabolites of things like estrogen and testosterone, progesterone. It's a urine test to figure out what's going on with hormones. Now, I'm recording this. This is middle of October in 2022. And a few weeks ago, about a month ago, I flew to San Francisco to teach a weekend seminar to a bunch of docs called functional endocrinology. And this is one of the first things that we talked about, is different testing methodologies. Like how do you peer into someone's hormonal systems to understand what their problems are? And we have only a couple of options. We can do blood testing, we can do saliva testing, or we can do urine testing. And to be honest, with blood and saliva, they both can be equally valuable, but they tell us different things about the same story. And so you have practitioners out there that are diehard blood testing only for hormones, and saliva is useless and it's inaccurate. That may have been true 40 years ago. It's not true now. And then you have the other docs that go, no, I'll only test hormones and saliva, and I would never do blood. And those tend to be kind of the fringe dwellers, if you will, of the natural medicine world. The truth is they can both be quite valuable, and there are some circumstances where you want both. And the reason is because they tell you two different things about the same problem. Without going into the reasons why that is, that's just the way it is. And so, in any given case, a clinician has to ask questions through their testing. And that's really why we run testing, is because we have questions about somebody's physiology. And if a test gives us answers to the questions we're asking, then yeah, it makes sense to run the test. And it just so happens that blood hormone testing and saliva hormone testing basically answer different questions about the hormonal system. So yes, they're both relevant. You can't say only one or only the other in every circumstance. That's just not the right way to do it. So many years ago, along comes this company that does this dry urine testing for total and complete hormones, something like that. And man, it took off like a rocket, because who wouldn't want to stay home and pee in a cup rather than go get their blood drawn, or spit in a tube for 20 minutes or so? It's a lot easier just to pee in a cup. Send that off to the lab and you get this elaborate test with all these ratios and calculations about what's happening with your hormones. Well, the problem is that's not what you're getting, because you can't, when it comes to your reproductive hormones, you can't measure hormones in urine. What's coming out in the urine are the metabolites of hormones. So basically, here's how it works. Let's assume someone's not taking exogenous hormones, right? They're not taking pills or creams or getting injections. It's just what their body is making. So that's called endogenous hormone production, what you're making yourself. So your system, your hypothalamic pituitary gonadal system, right? Your brain talking to your uterus, your ovaries, or your testes if you're a guy. Basically, that signaling results in the production of parent hormones like estrogens, progesterone, or androgens, testosterone, etc. They circulate around the body. They get metabolized by liver and gallbladder processes like phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Detoxification, they get metabolized to a certain extent by your microbiome, and you pee things out and you see the metabolites, or the end products of metabolism, of hormones that were produced by your glands or organs. Now, the problem with peeing in a cup and measuring metabolites of hormones and trying to make conclusions about what circulating hormones are actually in your blood and available to your cells to work with. The problem with that is that when you pee in a cup, it is always what we call post-renal and post-hepatic, meaning it's after the liver and the kidneys have done their job and taken that original hormonal compound, which exerts its influence on your system and on your cells, and transformed it somehow. And now all of a sudden you're measuring whatever that secondary or even tertiary byproduct is in your urine. And there are no studies that have established the consistent relationship between what we see in a cup and what's floating in your bloodstream. And at the very best, if someone pees in a cup to measure hormones or hormonal metabolites, and they have perfect liver, gallbladder detox function, they have perfect renal filtration, they have perfect microbiome, then maybe we can draw some conclusions about what's in the cup versus what's in your bloodstream. But the reality is, at least in my world, when someone comes to me and hormonal complaints are either the main reason they're seeing me or it's just part of a more complex picture, none of them have healthy guts and microbiome. None of them have good liver detoxification. Most of them have some degree of environmental toxicity and so on. And on top of that, they have other metabolic problems, whether that might be adrenal dysfunction, blood sugar issues, you name it, that affects how they metabolize hormones. And we think we can pee in a cup and measure metabolites that are 2-3 orders of magnitude downstream from that and make any conclusions about what's in their system. Doesn't work that way. It simply does not work that way. But if you get a hold of something like a dried urine hormone panel or work with a practitioner who hands you a report, it looks really slick. And it's full of a bunch of information, and they have diagrams and they have explanations. But I will tell you that when this one particular company that is known for this started doing this years ago, we had learned our lesson with the whole genetic nutrigenomic testing, the spectra cell testing, as well as the urinary neurotransmitters, to sit back and say, okay, well, this sounds good, but let's look at the physiology and the science and see if it's something that we want to start using in our practice. Well, lo and behold, we found, of course, that there were all kinds of obstacles to peeing in a cup and making any conclusions about your hormonal status. And we started teaching the real science in our functional medicine seminars. And inevitably, even, I'll tell you, just even a month ago in San Francisco, I had 45 doctors, somewhere around 45 doctors. And there were close to 10, about a quarter, let's call it 25% of the attendees were using this form of testing in their practice. And so when we went through the science and the physiology and helped them understand that when you pee in a cup and measure the urinary metabolites, that it does not or probably does not reflect what's happening up in the bloodstream, for these reasons, again, you can see like eyes dropping. And in fact, this one lady kind of signaled over to me and she put her hands up by her head and just went like her head was exploding. And she came to me after on one of the breaks and she's like, this is perhaps one of the best seminars I've ever been, because I'm getting so much clarity about why certain things in my practice don't work the way that I want them to. And this is the challenge that I and all other functional medicine practitioners have, let alone you guys who are healthcare consumers that may or may not have any degree of training in biochemistry or physiology or anything like that. Like, how can you expect yourself to figure this stuff out if the people who have the degrees, the training, and the credentials can't figure this out? Anyways, I'll go off on another half-hour rant, and I realize that I'm already way over time. But I wanted to do this one-off because I know it is not uncommon for clients who apply to work with me one-on-one. It's not uncommon for them to have one or more of these tests in their initial packet that they give to me that other practitioners have done for them. Whether that is some kind of an intracellular nutrient test, a nutrigenomic test, a urinary neurotransmitter test, or one of these dried urine hodgepodges, all of which represents wasted money and inactionable information. That's just the way it is. So there you have it. Thanks for hanging out with me. I know this has been a long one, but hopefully this was valuable to you, and we will see you next time on the Inflammation Nation. I'm Dr. Steve Noseworthy. We'll see you again. Thank you so much for listening to the Inflammation Nation. If you found this episode valuable, please rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast. Be the first to know when a new episode drops so that you can stay on top of your game. It also helps others like you find the answers they need. And why not head over to my main website, drnoseworthy.com, that's drnoseworthy.com, to explore my personalized functional medicine coaching programs, submit a question to the podcast, maybe take a quiz, or even reach out to me using the contact form that you can find there. We'll see you next time.